Let us pray. O Lord, we give thanks for the bounty of our province, our land, our resources, and our people. We pledge ourselves to act as good stewards on behalf of all Albertans. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and
Mr. Speaker, I move that the petition of Frederick L. Benini, Mervyn L. Henkelman, Peter D. McCune, David Starkle, and Ronald C. Swist for the Federal Canadian Trust and Bond Corporation be now read and received.
On the motion of the member for Calgary-McKnight, all those in favour? Opposed?
Presenting reports by standing and special committees.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 93, I have taken under consideration the petition for the Federal Canadian Trust and Bond Corporation Act and have to report to the Assembly that Standing Order 86 has not been complied with. The Private Bills Committee has considered the matter of that petition and recommends to the Assembly that the provisions of Standing Order 86 be waived to permit the bill to be dealt with once the proper advertising has been completed. I request the concurrence of the Assembly in this recommendation.
Does the Assembly concur in the recommendation? Opposed? So ordered.
Notices of motions.
Speaker, I would request permission to give oral notice of motion and would ask that all honourable members provide unanimous consent in order to deal with this motion today. Be it resolved that the Assembly congratulates the Edmonton Oilers, players, coaches, management and support staff for their fine achievement in winning their third Stanley Cup in 4 years. In moving the motion, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to salute the hard work, dedication, and team spirit which have carried the Oilers to victory. While some of my colleagues who hail from a point south of here may feel their loyalties lie elsewhere, nevertheless, I would ask all members as proud Albertans to join me in supporting the motion now before the House.
Member for Edmonton Beverly.
It was the intention of our party to also bring forward congratulations to the Oilers, but we are pleased to join with the government in extending our congratulations, and we're both delighted and pleased to do so. It was a great series. A great team won the series, and we congratulate the Oilers, the players, the coaching staff, and the management. The Stanley Cup is where it belongs, here in Edmonton.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon.
Just a moment to add, Liberal parties, the congratulations also, and particularly as one Calgarian that spent 14 years trying to move to Edmonton. It was indeed great to see them mark my move to this area by winning the Stanley Cup. But thank you. It was indeed one of those rare occasions that I can support the member from Fort McMurray, Lac La Biche, and I thank him for bringing it forward to the House.
Member for Clover Bar, raise the call.
Mr. Speaker, I too wish to support the motion. As a former member of the Golden Bear hockey team, I think maybe that I understand. That was almost before you were born, Dick. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it showed the character of a team that when they had to win, they did win. But at the same time that I say that, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, I think we have to pay tribute to the Philadelphia Flyers, because this was a team many of the boys are from Western Canada, a team that would not quit. And when I saw them miraculously being saved time after time by the goalpost, I thought that possibly this would be an upset in the making. But it didn't happen, and the Oilers prevailed, and they are truly Stanley Cup champions, Mr. Speaker.
Call for the question. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, if any dare, please say no. Motion carries. Let the record show unanimously, and the chair will be only too happy to write letters to both the Oilers and to the Philadelphia Flyers.
Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill 46, the hotel room tax. Mr. Speaker, this brings forward the new tax on hotel accommodation, which was announced in our budget on March the 20th. And as I have advised the Assembly before, Mr. Speaker, provides for the special exemption for those bookings which took place before the date of the budget up to November the 1st, 1987. And as well, Mr. Speaker, speaks to the exclusions in the legislation which provide protection for long-term accommodation and for various kinds of facilities, including student accommodation.
The Honourable Provincial Treasurer has moved for first reading Bill number 46, Hotel Room Tax Act. All those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Motion carries.
Bill 46, being Hotel Room Tax Act, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill 47, which is the Fuel Tax Act. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, this was put forward as part of the fiscal plan in the budget of March 20th, 1987. This tax, Mr. Speaker, as all Albertans know, is necessary for us to balance the size of our deficit and to generate other revenues for the province. But it should be noted specifically, Mr. Speaker, that this tax does not apply to farmers or off-road vehicles and therefore is very selective in its application. Mr. Speaker, and of course is below that recommended by my colleagues in the NDP party across the way.
The Honourable Provincial Treasurer has moved for first reading Bill 47, Fuel Tax Act. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say nay. Motion still carries.
Bill 47, being Fuel Tax Act, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time.
Speaker, I also request leave to introduce Bill 48, the Tobacco Tax Amendment Act. The member from Highlands may object to that, of course. That's right. She's up here. Mr. Speaker, this tax is an increase on the tax imposed on tobacco, as again announced in the budget. I request leave to introduce this bill, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Provincial Treasurer has moved for first reading Bill number 48, Tobacco Tax Amendment Act 1987. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Motion carries.
Bill 48, being Tobacco Tax Amendment Act 1987, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I have a final tax bill. Mr. Speaker, this is Bill number 49, which I request leave to introduce, the Tax Statutes Amendment Act 1987. This is a money bill, Mr. Speaker, and Her Honor, the Honourable Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of the contents of this bill, recommends to the same to the Assembly. Mr. Speaker, this is a combined bill which reflects the tax initiatives in our fiscal plan for the personal and corporate tax adjustments. All honourable members have now had an opportunity to examine those proposals. We'll have an opportunity now again to debate the principles of this legislation. But in a few words, Mr. Speaker, on the personal tax side, this increases the tax rates for individuals in this province, including the increase in the fundamental provincial rate, the application of a surtax, and the application of a flat tax. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, the Act speaks to the changes in the corporate tax amendment
and the corporate tax increases as well affect the larger corporations, where in fact a 4% increase is affected by this proposal. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, the these tax legislations also deal with the petroleum, the royalty reduction, which has been extended to the end of 1987, and as well in response to an agreement, the tax agreement which this province has with the federal government, Mr. Speaker. This legislation, both on the personal and corporate side, also reflects those common adjustments which are found in the corporate proposals to make our act uniform with the federal legislation. Moreover, more on a routine basis, there are adjustments which, again, in terms of tax harmony with other provinces and with the federal government, speak to the question of interest and interest charge and overpayments and underpayments by taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, I move first reading of Bill 49.
The Honourable Provincial Treasurer has moved first reading of Bill 49, Tax Statutes Amendment Act 1987. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Motion carries.
Bill 49, Tax Statutes Amendment Act 1987, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table the annual report for the Alberta Electric Energy Marketing Agency for the year 1986-87, and to file with the Assembly, Mr. Speaker, 5 copies of the press conference we had today kicking off National Transportation Week.
Introduction of special guests.
Minister of Culture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to introduce to you and to members of the Assembly 14 energetic grade 5 and 6 students from the I.L. Peretz School in my constituency who are in the Members Gallery. They're accompanied by 2 teachers, Mrs. Nassim and Mrs. Shaheen, and parents, Mr. Cyril Nassim, Mrs. Linda Horowitz, Mrs. Yvonne Greenbaum, Mr. Joe Shikowitz, and Mr. Don Johnson, who is the bus driver. I had a chance to meet with these students just before we entered the Assembly, and they have some interesting and very intelligent questions. I'd ask them all to rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Edmonton Belmont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the member for Edmonton Centre, it's a pleasure today to introduce to you, and indeed to all members of the Legislative Assembly, 17 students, grade 10 to 12 students from St. Joseph's High School in the constituency of Edmonton Centre. They're accompanied by teacher Mrs. Lynn Smarsh, and they're seated in the members' gallery as well. I'd ask that they rise and receive the traditional welcome of the Assembly.
Minister of Education, then Edmonton Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, seated in the public gallery are 23 students from the Laurier Heights School in the Edmonton-Glenora constituency. They are accompanied by their teacher, Mrs. Esther Woodrow, and I would ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of this Assembly.
Edmonton Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the member from Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche, I would like to introduce a prominent farmer from the Athabasca area. He's been very active on many boards, and his name is Brian McCutcheon. I'm not sure which gallery he's in, but I would like him to rise and receive the warm welcome of this House.
Ministerial statements.
Mr. Speaker, Albertans are indeed fortunate to have a veritable wealth of natural beauty at our doorsteps. It is our heritage, and it is a trust we do not take lightly. Mr. Speaker, this past weekend marked the beginning of Environment Week. Environment Week affords us an opportunity each year to take stock of what we have, to appreciate the many wonderful natural resources this province possesses, and to renew our commitment to safeguarding these treasures for future generations. We are fortunate to have a group of dedicated people, the Environment Week Association of Alberta, who coordinate activities and promote awareness of and appreciation for our environment. The theme for this year's celebration is Our Environment, the Home We Share. I feel that this is particularly appropriate because our environment is truly the home we share. It is the air we breathe, our rivers and lakes, our cities and our rural lands, and the life that they sustain. It is also the way that they are connected and the effects they have on each other. This interdependence, this sharing of responsibility, is a cornerstone of Alberta Environment's mission. I'd like to commend the fine work that the Environment Week Association has done in encouraging and coordinating hundreds of events throughout the province. I'd also like to thank the many municipalities, industries, environmental interest groups, and community leagues that are helping to make Environment Week 87 such a great success by organizing events and raising environmental awareness throughout Alberta. In particular, my thanks to my colleagues, the Honourable Don Sparrow and the Honourable Norm Weiss, who have given Environment Week their personal support and have directed their staffs at Forestry, Lands and Wildlife and Recreation Parks to contribute in a major way to Environment Week. I encourage all honourable members to find time in their very busy schedules to get involved in celebrating Environment Week. I want all Albertans to appreciate and to acknowledge our environment, the home we share. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, in replying to the ministerial announcement, I don't think I can disagree with any of the words and any of the sentiment here. Mr. Speaker, the only thing I would hope that the government, though, would back up the nice words with some prosecutions in the future. And I would say that to the minister and to this government that anybody that studies these and looks at the recent polls now in Canada, the United States, and other places in the world, one of the major issues for people in the future will be our environment. And people are not going to accept shoddy work done with our environment. They will not accept it from governments in the future. And I would say, Mr. Speaker, that I couldn't agree more with what was said in here. But we're going to expect, because of these sentiments, Mr. Speaker, we're going to expect much more environmental concerns, much more prosecutions, and much more work done on the environment. Because, frankly, this government's record in the past in environmental matters has not been one that we should write home about, Mr. Speaker. But recognizing now that we have, again, Mr. Speaker, some nice words, we will be watching to make sure that those words are actually put into practice. And one of the things I want to see very quickly in this House is some charges laid in the recent Calgary case, which we were led to believe would be coming from this government.
Oral question period.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct my first question to the Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, today is the first anniversary of the Gaynors labour dispute. Mr. Speaker, as much as any single event can, and that can cause or cause the need for Albertans to look at labour laws, it was this one particular event. I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that it will be a historical strike, unfortunately. But it showed to almost all Albertans that we need to restore the balance required for harmonious labour relations. My question to this minister, on this anniversary, will the minister advise whether the government will introduce such legislation during the current sitting of this House?
Mr. Speaker, in the preamble, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition tried to relate the whole matter to the Gaynors dispute. I would point out once more, and this is for the umpteenth time, that the initiation of the review of our labour legislation was not related to the dispute on 66th Street, that it was announced prior to that dispute starting, and that it was a long-term review of what has happened in the past and to try and develop labour legislation for the future. The legislation will be introduced at this sitting of the legislature.
A supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. We would hope that this is going to be fair legislation, but by the record of this government, I'll hold my breath until I see it. But one of the questions I want to ask this minister has to do with replacement workers. Surely this is one of the major causes of labour problems in this province, and it should be obvious to most people. My question is simply to the minister, can the minister update us, and have they decided to curb the use of replacement workers in 24-hour lockouts?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member won't go blue in the face waiting. He'll have the legislation in a short period of time, and then he'll be able to see what's in it.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. We've been told that this legislation was coming last session, this session, and we're waiting for it patiently, Mr. Speaker, but I think people want to know. I'll be a little more specific, though. In terms of replacement workers, it's an issue in the Ziedler Forest Products dispute at Slave Lake.
Now that the company has a replacement workforce, they have no interest in negotiations and incentive whatever to bargain with their employees. Mr. Speaker, the minister said on April the 28th that he would be getting in touch with the company if they got back to returning his phone calls. At least Mr. Campbell's secretary from Zealers had said that. Could the minister update us? Has he been successful finally in having a telephone conversation with Mr. Campbell, and has he been successful in organizing a meeting between the two groups?
Mr. Speaker, I had a meeting with Mr. Campbell some time ago. I've since then had a meeting with Mr. Pizak from the International Woodworkers of America. In fact, that was last week, but I did communicate with him sometime in advance of that, that in the meetings that the Premier and I had with Mr. Monroe from Vancouver and Mr. Pizak, and the subsequent meeting that I had with Mr. Campbell, we could see little middle ground between the positions of the two parties, and that therefore they would have to continue negotiating with each other, with the assistance, if they wish, of the mediator from the department.
Well, supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. The problem is that there's a whole group of replacement workers in that plant, so the company refuses to negotiate. And I would point out to the minister that today in BC we see what happens when a government attempts to balance the scales in favor of management. My question is that all the minister is going to do in this particular strike? He's not going to do anything else, say it's up to them, and that's no more responsibility on this minister's behalf?
Mr. Speaker, I had some discussions, as I said, with Mr. Pizak, and I made a commitment to Mr. Pizak as to what I was prepared to do that I felt might be useful, and that commitment I will fulfill. The commitment was made to the International Woodworkers of America, not the Leader of the Opposition, and I will fulfill the commitment I made to the IWA negotiator in this instance.
Supplementary, Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Supplementary to the minister, and back to the original question on the forthcoming report to the legislature, which would be nice to get before the House prorogues and then have the whole summer to look at it. But could the minister let the House know whether or not the new act will combine the Employment Standards Act and the Labour Act, or whether they will be in two separate acts as it is now?
Sorry, it's clearly anticipatory, and that was the difficulty with the lead question from the Leader of the Opposition. Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Hospitals and Medicare. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, the Minister met with the Advisory Council on Women's Issues. And following the meeting, we're led to believe that he suggested that the government may have gone too far in cutting some contraceptive services, and that he would ask his cabinet colleagues to consider making some changes in the government's hit list for Medicare cuts. Well, Mr. Speaker, this was encouraging. At least there's some movement. And now, noticing that the minister's new flexibility, would the minister consider putting this whole package of cuts on hold while the cabinet reviews its position?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the meeting of last week with the Women's Council was a very useful one from 2 points of view. It gave myself and 2 of my cabinet colleagues an opportunity to understand firsthand what the concerns were that had been expressed to members of the Women's Council. It also gave us an opportunity to provide to the Council information about what had actually occurred or what was being proposed, rather than having to draw that information through the media, much of which was not portrayed exactly as it was. So there was a sharing of information in both directions, which was very useful. The commitment that I made was that I would bring forward to a cabinet meeting at some future time the concerns that they had expressed, but I did not make any commitment to reconsider, only to ensure that cabinet colleagues were aware of the concerns that were expressed by the Women's Council. I wish to advise the Honourable Leader of the Opposition again, Mr. Speaker, that these changes to the health care insurance plan were all fully discussed in our Cabinet and caucus for some weeks and months prior to the implementation. We believe very strongly today, as I did 2 weeks ago when we announced them, that they are fair and across the board, no great imposition on any one individual, and that we still have the very best health care insurance plan in Alberta that exists anywhere in Canada.
supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. The minister may well have discussed it with Cabinet and caucus. It may be a shock to them, but they don't represent all the people of Alberta. And my question is simply this, that this cuts of 2 weeks ago were unfair towards women, and that's what he's been hearing. Instead of talking to the caucus, why didn't the minister consult with the women and their organizations before implementing these cuts, not after?
Mr. Speaker, the changes that were made to the health care insurance plan were not designed nor were they attack on any one particular group of people. I had consultations with a wide variety of people before the announcements were made, and I think that they are fair and reasonable right across the board.
If that's the case, Mr. Minister, would the minister tell us, besides the Cabinet and besides the caucus, what formal women's groups do you sit down and talk about these cuts with? Well, fill us in on that, Mr. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that a number of the professional groups have made representations to us, including the Alberta Medical Association, the Association of Chiropractors and Physiotherapists, and a lot of others who are in the healthcare business have a good understanding of the needs of both males and females when it comes to health care. It wasn't our intent to try to seek out various groups that may represent some narrower point of view to have discussions in this regard. We wanted to meet with organizations and groups of people who would have a broad perspective in the whole area of what was covered by our health care insurance plan. And we did that, and I think if the Honourable Leader of the Opposition would care to look at what exists in other provinces, he'll find that the provisions of the health care insurance plan here are still, on balance, the best of any in Canada.
Mr. Speaker, I expect that women are going to find it rather amazing that they're considered a narrower group and that the AMA represents them, because that's what I was asking about, which women's groups he consulted with. But given that the minister has made at least a small retreat on the sterilization issue, would he not agree that to have now a public hearing process before he brings any of the cuts so people have a right to express their viewpoint on this matter?
Mr. Speaker, I find these questions rather strange. The people who were elected in this province to deal with such matters and debate issues of this nature are the 82 MLAs that sit in this legislative assembly. Unfortunately, even though I had asked in this legislature at least 5 times in the last 3 months to have the Leader of the Opposition and his party make some suggestions with respect to the health care insurance plan, they made absolutely none. They made absolutely none. The Hansard record will show that I've asked on several occasions and I've received absolutely nothing. So all I can conclude is that the Leader of the Opposition is really not interested in running a health care insurance plan within the budget we have. He's only interested in waiting until after we make his decisions and then complaining about them.
Chair recognizes Edmonton Goldbar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, if the minister refuses to reconsider these regressive steps, will the minister at least commit to the House that public health and community services are given immediately more direction and resources in order to meet the present and growing need?
Mr. Speaker, in discussing this matter last week, I indicated that a recent report, which I hope members opposite now have a copy of, called In Trouble, A Way Out, which was done for the directors of Alberta's community health system, indicates that the best direction to go in providing better, more timely information and counseling, particularly for teenagers, is through community-based clinics and through the education system, as opposed to increasing the amount or the frequency of billings through doctors' offices. Indeed, the report indicates that most teenagers simply will not visit the family doctor for these purposes. So I've indicated, and so has my colleague, the Minister of Community Occupational Health, that it's our view that we ought to try and put more resources in this direction. Now, there are, for example, 80% of the funding of the Family and Community Support Services program, a program the honourable member would be familiar with, having sat on a city council, does come from the provincial government. There's nothing to prevent a very substantial portion of those dollars from going into counseling. And the Minister of Community and Occupational Health has been discussing both with municipalities involved in the Family and Community Support Services program and with the local health units their priorities on this area. We can't have it both ways. Members opposite oftentimes ask us to leave the flexibility in the local community. That's what we've done in this regard. But we're now asking them to take a second look at where they're putting these funds and see if more of it can't be put into the area we're talking about.
Member for Clover Bar.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the Minister of Health. Is the Minister giving any consideration to making the patient sign the claim form for the dual purposes of, number one, making sure that the service has been rendered, and number two, to make the patient aware of how much the service costs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've been talking about that for several months and have not yet had any success in getting an agreement with the Alberta Medical Association that such a system could be worked out. I'm confident it could be if we had cooperation from all parties. There is, however, some optimism. The Association of Physical Therapists, during the course of discussing their fee schedules and a number of other matters, did make a commitment to me to involve themselves in an attempt at putting together a trial project that would have everyone who visits a physiotherapist in fact sign the bill, acknowledge the cost, and know what it is. And if we can put that in place and make it work there, I'm confident we can move it over into the medical community as well.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon, followed by Clover Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is to the Minister of Agriculture. Certainly with the farmers are facing a crisis here in this province with world grain subsidies lowering our own prices, and the fact that 1 out of every 3 jobs in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, depends on the agricultural sector. I was quite disappointed, Mr. Speaker, to find that the Premier and his 3 Western colleagues have been unable to provide any new approaches or new ideas of just how we're going to solve a problem. The first question, Mr. Speaker, I noticed you poised to get up there. I thought, no, I wasn't. Mr. Speaker, was that the Prime Minister has stated that the federal government will not be forthcoming with an additional direct aid for farmers. Can the Minister tell this Assembly, outside of maybe accessing the lottery funds, has he any idea just what he's going to do for the farmers this summer?
Mr. Speaker, firstly, may I correct the honourable member from Westlock Sturgeon, because the Prime Minister did not indicate that. The Prime Minister indicated that he wished to have a period of time to do a thorough assessment as to the needs of the agricultural sector prior to committing himself to an additional specials grains program. And again, contrary, Mr. Speaker, to what the honourable member had just suggested, the Premier did come forward with a number of worthwhile suggestions by way of communiques after the Western Premiers Conference in Humboldt. A number of those suggestions related to an additional special grains payout for the upcoming crop year. In addition to that, they discussed such topics such as red meat stabilization, greater efficiencies within our transportation system, and further soil conservation and research, Mr. Speaker. So contrary to what the honourable member said, there was a great deal of worthwhile work completed and a number of good suggestions forthcoming from the Western Premiers Conference.
Mr. Speaker, that wasn't the question. The question was what this government was going to do to help farm incomes this summer. Could the minister tell the House whether or not he would at least go so far, or whether the minister would go so far as to tell the federal government that setting up a second debt review board is not that much help? And would he indeed ask the Farm Credit Corporation to reinstate their old policy that had just expired a few months ago of not doing any foreclosures on anyone holding a Farm Credit Corporation loan? Could he at least go that far for at least 1 year before the Farm Credit Corporation will foreclose on farms?
Mr. Speaker, we've made a number of recommendations to the federal government as it relates to the Farm Credit Corporation, one of which we've indicated on a consistent basis that they should drop their interest rate on loans overall to 9%. But we acknowledge that we have a big responsibility as it relates to agriculture because of the importance that it does play to our province. And that is why our provincial treasurer was so forthcoming in his support for the agricultural sector in the budget that was recently tabled in this House. If one looks at it, We have a continuation of the 14-cent differential for farmers as it relates to fuel, which costs somewhere in the vicinity of $97 million, and a foregone tax revenue of some $40 million because they don't pay the 5-cent tax. In addition to that, we've got the worthwhile $2 billion program, a program that's unmatched anywhere in the world as it relates to establishing strict criteria for the needs of the credit needs of the agricultural sector. Just recently, we had the opportunity to, Mr. Speaker, to announce the establishment of a tripartite program for the sugar beet producers in southern Alberta, which is an extension of our $15 million commitment through tripartite stabilization programs. In addition to that, we've continued on with a number of worthwhile research projects, one in the Honourable Member for Vegreville's constituency, whereby we've committed an additional $2 million in conjunction with the federal government, whereby we're doing research for soil and conservation. Mr. Speaker, and I can go on for a period of time as it relates to our commitment, and it's unparalleled by any province throughout this great country of ours.
I don't know what button I pushed, Mr. Speaker, but I nearly got drowned there. But and I'm sure he forgot one other scheme, but that was helping out the Minister of Energy by force-feeding oil to the cows. But Mr. Speaker, I am interested in knowing whether or not the Minister is working jointly with the federal government in a scheme whereby we could guarantee the grain farmers an income that was equal to 75% of the average of their last 5 years' income.
Mr. Speaker, there is the Western Grain Stabilization Act, which takes into account the fluctuations and does provide some security to the grain sector. We acknowledge that we should go even further. And let me indicate to the honourable member, I would hope that it's not misunderstood. We acknowledge the difficulties that the agricultural sector is facing, and that is why we are doing exactly as the honourable member has suggested. We are working with other provincial governments and the federal government in furtherance to our national agricultural strategy in developing proposals such as equity financing for the agricultural sector, further examination of more responsive areas to be better in helping with the credit needs of agriculture. We are doing a considerable amount of work acknowledging the severe difficulties that agriculture is facing.
Mr. Speaker, the farmers are concerned. They'd like to see that cash cow that the minister is working on come fresh this year. Now, would the minister be able to let the House know just what progress he is making towards a suggestion that we made earlier in the year, and now many other farm groups are talking about it, including the wheat pool, which is an income stabilization plan rather than subsidies, something very similar to the negative income tax that he said he was looking into. Has he had anything further to report on that method of stabilizing income?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we've made some progress in that area, not as it specifically relates to the suggestion brought forward by the honourable member, because as I indicated to him in previous times, that falls more directly under federal jurisdiction. If he's taken the opportunity to read the comprehensive report that was tabled by our Associate Minister as it relates to hail and crop insurance, you will see that there's a number of specific recommendations in that report, one dealing with a revenue or cost of production insurance, which we're hoping we will reach a positive conclusion in the talks that we are having with the federal government and other provinces. Mr. Speaker, this is in addition to what the federal government has done, and they have contributed millions of dollars to our grain sector. As the honourable member is aware, the $1 billion is unparalleled throughout the history of this country. In addition to that, they have a close to $1 billion deficit in the Western Grain Stabilization account now, because they also acknowledge the difficulties that the grain sector is facing.
Supplementary, Vegreville.
I'm sure the minister's words make all of the farmers in Alberta feel much better, but I'm wondering, in view of the fact that this government has committed money to a tripartite stabilization plan for sugar beets and for red meat producers, and came up with money to help livestock producers when the drought was serious, how does the minister justify this government's refusal to contribute to a deficiency payment for grain producers this year?
Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the honourable member for Vegreville has said, we haven't refused, and we have been consistent. We have been consistent in our support for the grain sector, because the grain sector receives greater support than the livestock sector does on a per capita basis, not only in this province but throughout Canada. Our farm fuel allowance is much more beneficial to the grain sector. Our farm credit stability program again, of direct benefit to the grain sector. We are supporting the grain sector, Mr. Speaker, and we have not excluded the possibility of direct support through a deficiency payment. We've indicated we're not about to commit ourselves to it until we've had an opportunity to thoroughly examine the pros and the cons of participating in that. Unlike the honourable member, we want to give serious and thorough thought prior to jumping into making a decision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Main questions or supplementary? Main question, member for Clover Bar, followed by Red Deer North, followed by Vegreville.
My question is also to the Minister of Agriculture, and it's a continuation of the question the honourable member from Westlock asked. And in the minister's monitoring of the group that was in Ottawa meeting with the federal minister, where the group was looking at $2.6 million, is the minister any place close to getting a commitment as to when some funding will be available through the federal government for the farmers of Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, I haven't had a chance yet to meet with some of the individuals who did meet with our federal counterparts, but I am doing so this week. I'm meeting with the president of Unifarm during the course of this week to gain the benefit of his insights as to that meeting. In addition to that, we're doing some work in conjunction with Unifarm in coming forward with figures as to what will be required as to the exact amounts for a deficiency payment to keep their income stabilized.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the minister or the provincial treasurer. Is the government looking at any type of program of possibly allowing interest to accumulate for 3 years on the Farm Credit Stability Program? So because of the time of crunch that we're in now, that interest could accumulate for 3 years and be applied to the principal.
At this present time, no, Mr. Speaker, we are not, but I should indicate, as I've indicated to the honourable member in the past, that we are on an ongoing basis continually assessing our programs to make sure that they are as responsive as possible and that we can, in a very practical way, afford the continued support to the agricultural sector.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the minister. Is the minister also looking at the possibility of reducing rates? Because on a $200,000 loan at 9%, the interest is $18,000. If that is reduced to 3%, Mr. Speaker, then that's $12,000, which will keep most farm families alive and put bread on the table. Is the minister looking at this alternative?
Mr. Speaker, I can only repeat what I indicated earlier to the honourable member, that we are on a continuous basis assessing our programs to make sure that they are responsive to the agricultural sector. But I would throw it back to the honourable member. I would challenge him to show me a lending institution that will offer secured capital funding for a period of 20 years at the rate of 9%. It's a substantial commitment on the part of this government whereby we are guaranteeing the loans so that the agricultural sector will have that secured credit for a period of 20 years at 9%. If we find that we do have additional resources, we can reassess it. But all I can do is offer the honourable member the assurance that we are going to reassess our agricultural programs as best we can so that they are responsive to the concerns of individual farmers.
Mr. Speaker, final supplementary, and I'm suggesting the minister doesn't have to be on a 20-year basis, it can be on an interim basis because of the financial situation as it is. My final supplementary is the Minister of Economic Development. Because the minister comes from a small town, can the minister indicate what monitoring is going on in the Minister's Department or the Provincial Treasurer or the Minister of Agriculture's Department as to what effect the downturn in the agricultural economy is having on small town Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, very careful monitoring is going on. We, through our regional small business offices, which are located strategically throughout the province, we maintain close contact in terms of information with respect to the impact of the downturn in grain prices on the economies of all parts of the province. And it does vary throughout the province. Some areas have a greater cattle population and greater predominance in terms of feeding up the grain to cattle and hogs, where others tend to concentrate on grain. And also in some areas, certain communities have other sources of economic strength, such as the forestry industry or oil and gas. But we do, Mr. Speaker, monitor very closely the economic situation throughout the province.
No, out of order. Sorry, out of order. Thank you. Red Deer, Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Speakers, to the Minister again on the interest. The Minister is quite correct in pointing out a 20-year loan at 9% is an attractive one, but also the member for Glover has also pointed out how hard it is to make interest payments, particularly if you have no taxable income. Couldn't the Minister at least consider adding the interest charges for those farmers that are not in a position to pay income tax, adding those interest charges to the loan, in other words, capitalizing the interest, which extends the loan a measly few months at the end of the 20 years?
Mr. Speaker, a good many of those individuals that did roll over their loans into our new $2 billion program did exactly that, to allow them the opportunity for additional payments.
Red Deer North, followed by Vegreville, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Technology, Research and Telecommunications. Sinfar Laboratories recently announced a joint venture agreement between Dr. Ronald Mikatesh, a U of A researcher, and the Taiho Pharmaceutical Company of Japan. I'm just wondering if the Minister had to come up with any investment dollars to see this venture come to pass, and if so, how many dollars?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in response to the honourable member for Red Deer North, the answer is that there was no investment by the provincial government in the Sinfar Laboratory joint venture between Taiho Pharmaceuticals of Japan and Dr. Mikatesh. Mr. Speaker, I would indicate that that is the first Japanese joint venture pharmaceutical company to come to Canada, and we consider it a very major development for Alberta.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, well, regardless of the fact that there are no government dollars involved, is the Minister not concerned that this venture is going to conflict with work being done by Chem Biomed Limited, which does have considerable government investment?
Mr. Speaker, no. The Chem Biomed company has as a foundation of its initiative the work of Dr. Raymond Lemieux. The connection between the two would be the fact that over a number of years there have been a variety of spin-offs and developments at our university in the area of pharmaceuticals, and so if we can put it this way, Chem Biomed is a lightning rod company and therefore is attracting attention to Alberta and to Alberta researchers. There is not a competitive relationship, I would suggest. Rather, it is more likely to be, and I believe it to be, a complementary relationship between the two companies.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister explain how he believes that this development between a university researcher and a Japanese firm is going to benefit either the U of A specifically or Alberta generally?
Mr. Speaker, in addition to the joint venture, Taiho Pharmaceuticals has agreed to set up a foundation in Alberta, the purpose of which will be to fund in the amount of $50,000 per annum exchanges between Japanese universities and Alberta, particularly the University of Alberta. And, Mr. Speaker, the very significant advantage of that is that this area is a very expensive one in which to do research. And more large projects, I believe, will be developed in a number of different centers at the same time on a complementary cooperative basis. This, if you will, is the beginning of a network, and I think it's very important for that reason. The other advantage to the University of Alberta is that it does provide students, graduate students at the University of Alberta, with the most up-to-date access to research that is available in Japan, and that will come about through the exchange of professors using the fund that's been established by the Foundation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If this is such a good news story and if no funding was required from the government, can the Minister tell us what factors did contribute to Taiho choosing Alberta as its point of entry?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, there is, as I mentioned earlier, the pioneer work of Dr. Raymond Lemieux, which is established in the area of chemistry and biochemistry and radiating into pharmaceuticals, the renown and fame, if you will, of the researchers at the University of Alberta. I would be remiss if I didn't compliment the Deputy Premier, Honourable David Russell, who has played a role by having gone to Japan and, among others, when he was visiting there, he visited the president of Taiho Pharmaceuticals, Mr. Kobayashi. Additionally, the Agent General in Japan, Mr. Ivan Bumstead, has been very active working with this file for several years. So it's been a combination of a number of events, and I suspect that the recent announcements by President Nakasone of Japan, which is causing their attitudes somewhat to change and to try to move outward and establish branches and joint ventures elsewhere. I think that's been a factor. Finally, I would want to commend the Consul General of Japan, Mr. Funakoshi, here in Alberta for his participation and support of this particular venture.
Supplementary, Edmonton Meadowlark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the minister saying then to this legislature that $50,000 for exchanges and some attracting a few graduate students and maybe a few projects is enough return for the kind of indirect and direct investment we make through our university to projects such as these, when millions upon millions upon millions of dollars can be made by the spin-off projects and the spin-off developments? There are no guarantees that these projects and these developments will take place in Alberta and create jobs here and create economic development here. They can go back to Japan, they can go anywhere.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member for Edmonton Meadowlark is slightly steamed this afternoon. It's too bad it's the wrong kind of steam. Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. Taiho Pharmaceutical started out in 1963 with assets in the range of $1 million. Today, Taiho Pharmaceutical has assets in the range of $500 million. Taiho Pharmaceutical is undertaking the joint venture just simply to do research, putting into Alberta approximately $2 million per year. The President, Mr. Kobayashi, made it very clear to me that they intend to establish a manufacturing facility in Alberta, and even Mr. Speaker, there were at least 30 signatures on 5 different agreements, and they provide.
Honourable Minister, with due respect, when a member asks a supplementary and then is foolish enough to start asking another question in the midst of the minister's response, all we're going to do is keep spinning on and out the time of the question period, and we have another 4 or 5 people who would like to get in. Therefore, the chair recognizes Vegreville, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark, if there's time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Associate Minister of Agriculture. This government's response to the alarming number of foreclosures and bankruptcies on Alberta farms was to promise a review of the Agricultural Development Corporation. Hearings were held around the province over the winter, and many farmers took part in these hearings, expecting that meaningful changes would be made before it was too late. My question to the Associate Minister, does she stand by her statement in the House of May 22nd when she said, "We do not have the ADC Review Committee's report at this time in our caucus"? Is she saying that the caucus, the rural caucus, the Conservative Party, has not seen the recommendations of this review committee?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I'd like to know, for the sake of farmers in Alberta, what the delay is. These hearings were completed almost 3 months ago, and it's certainly an urgent situation. Will the minister explain what on earth has happened to the recommendations of this committee if it hasn't yet been presented to the Tory caucus?
Mr. Speaker, the problem of finance in rural Alberta and particularly in agriculture is very difficult and very complicated. And we're looking at new and innovative ways of financing agriculture, and it entails a lot of discussions between groups that may be involved and other governments too, because what we're looking at impacts all across Canada.
Will the minister try and explain the delay to us a little further? I'm wondering, is it the case that this government is waiting until after the session is over so that the report can be introduced and be spared the scrutiny of opposition examination?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Is it the government's intention then that a large number of the cases that are currently being foreclosed and quitclaim through the ADC would go through the mill and fall by the wayside before any meaningful changes are recommended by this government?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, a supplemental. Could the minute people are losing their farms while this committee wanders around while trying to make up its mind, could the minister tell the House whether she would be willing to suspend any foreclosures until the committee's report comes in?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Edmonton Meadowlark. Edmonton Meadowlark, second time of asking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Technology, Research and Telecommunications, in response to my question regarding a decision on unfair competition by AGT in the audio equipment sales industry, said, and I quote Hansard, May 11, 1987, "I can say that in terms of a final decision with respect to audio, I made that final decision and communicated it some time ago," unquote, thereby inferring that he was getting AGT out of that area of commercial enterprise. If that's the case, Mr. Speaker, to the minister, could the minister please indicate what... Tough question. Could the minister please indicate why personnel from AGT were at a pre-tender meeting last week to discuss information regarding an audio and intercom system for a school in Mundare? Who's running that department?
Mr. Speaker, I will check for the honourable member as to who's running the corporation. It is a commission board which runs a corporation.
The minister indicated at that time as well that, and I quote, that the decision with respect to audio will bear watching to see how well it is executed. Is the minister now admitting here that this is the first step that he will take to watch to see how well it is executed? Has he done nothing else to ensure that this Mundare incident wouldn't have happened last week?
Mr. Speaker, I've continued to have consultations and reviews, and I will continue to do that. I indicated as well in responding earlier that there were some gray areas between the audio and the telecommunications activities. I am not familiar, and I don't think that it is reasonable to expect that I would be familiar with every tender that AGT might possibly look at. But I will be happy to look into the matter and determine what, in fact, kind of a tender it is.
The minister should be aware of whether or not his directives are being complied with. What steps is the minister taking to ensure that AGT can't simply decide to invest in a product, make a major investment, decide to reverse that decision on direction from the minister, and then waste all the money that's been invested to get us into that product in the first place?
Mr. Speaker, I believe, if I understood the question properly, that the answer, the assurance that the honourable member is seeking is in the very nature of the structure. I have the responsibility as representative of the government and the owner for very broad policy direction. There is, to develop that further, a commission board or commissioners of Alberta Government Telephones to whom report administrative staff. The operational questions are clearly responsibilities of administrative staff.
Is the minister actually saying then that a decision to be in audio equipment or not to be in audio equipment is strictly an operational decision when in fact he has argued clearly in this House, stated clearly in this House that he has asked that corporation not to be in it and they are continuing to be in it? Could he please clarify the distinction between administrative and broad brush policy decisions that he's talking about?
Mr. Speaker, the problem seems to be not whether we be or not be, but whether we be answering question number 3 or question number 2. My response that I've just gave in the preceding question was one of a broader nature that the honourable member asked. Now he's asking about policy direction, and I already have given that answer.
Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the Minister of the Environment, some weeks ago, Mr. Carl Primus, who is then Assistant Deputy Minister of Environmental Protection Services, publicly restated the minister's ongoing policy of not revealing the exact locations of waste sites, at least until after the legislative session ends. For this, he was given what I believe bureaucrats call a lateral demotion. Considering this reverse reward for open honesty, can the minister explain how his refusal to allow an assistant deputy minister to speak on behalf of his section agrees with the minister's promises of open and informative environment department?
Mr. Speaker, on the 14th day of April, I believe it was, I responded to several questions with respect to locations of certain possible hazardous waste sites, and I also filed information at that particular day. The individual in question certainly did not fulfill what the honourable members talked about in the first part of his question.
Thank you. Concerning the short list of 15 toxic waste sites, can the minister confirm, deny, or explain the assertion of Mr. Primus that in compiling the short list, the department excluded those sites which might show up on municipal and industrial surveys, and this means that some of the potentially most dangerous sites could have been excluded from that list?
Mr. Speaker, it's not my intent to comment on what another individual may have said. I think that my position and the position of the government with respect to the location of the sites that are requested as a result of the Help Eliminate Landfill Pollution Program are clearly written here in Hansard, and in fact, as I recall, it's the 14th day of April, I tabled certain information that made public.
Thank you. None of them consisted of clear answers from the minister. Is it possible, and indeed is it the case, that the old Uniroyal site where Agent Orange and pentachlorophenol were produced was on the longer list of sites, but was, for reasons I just mentioned, excluded from the short list of 15?
Time for question period has expired. Might we have the unanimous consent of the House to complete this series of questions? Opposed? Carried. Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said now on a number of occasions, both inside and outside the House, that we had received some 76 responses or inputs from the people of Alberta with respect to our public appeal under the Help Eliminate Landfill Pollution Program, and some 61 were dealt with, as I explained earlier, nearly 2 months ago, I guess now, and some 15 were dealt with by way of the statement that I made in the House on that particular day in April, including a listing of location and a map as well.
Thank you. How does the minister justify refusing to immediately give the public the whole truth about all of these sites so that they can not only make their own judgments based on complete and accurate information, but perhaps could even supplement the information the minister has now because it might jog their memory?
Mr. Speaker, I, again, now to be quite redundant, have provided information to the House, provided information to the public of Alberta with respect to a certain number of sites. I've repeated time and time again that that information was based on what we had to that period of time, and I indicated as well that upon further review and more specific site location, that I will be bringing more information available, and I basically, in a response to a question as to when you might be doing that, I indicated approximately the first week of July. And the reason the first week of July was selected is that Phase 1 of the Help Eliminate Landfill Pollution Program, which is the inventory side of the program, is due to, in my view, I requested information by the last day of June. So within a matter of several days after assembling the information for the inventory, I indicated I would provide that information.
Westlock Sturgeon.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, since the first part of July is coming up quite fast, and the minister must have most of his investigations finished, can the minister tell the House whether he's, in the case of some of the unreported dumps whether or not he is considering, or his department considering, any prosecutions?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, now to be redundant, I guess this is about the 5th time we've dealt with this. There are 3 phases to the Help Eliminate Landfill Pollution program. All members will recall that Phase 1, which is an inventory, is an appeal to the citizens of Alberta to basically go through their memories and try and find a dump, landfill that may have been located in the province of Alberta in the decades prior to the 1970s. We've asked them to go back and research their memories to go through the 1960s, the 1950s, the 1940s, and back. In addition to that, we've sent out letters to all of the municipalities in the province of Alberta and some 500 to 600 industries in the province of Alberta, asked them to go through those records as well. Phase 1 is the inventory side. Phase 2, and in essence, will be an evaluation, required evaluation on sites if we believe that there, in fact, the possibility, underline the word possibility, of a toxic or hazardous waste site. And Phase 3 of the program would be the mitigation side of the program. That's been stated now repeatedly, been advertised in every paper in the province of Alberta, and by way of letters to, as I indicate, all the municipalities and industries in our province.
Time for question period has expired. Orders of the day.